Okay. Welcome to Talking Smart, conversations with educators and philosophers from around the world. I'm your host, Richard Morehouse. Our guest today is Jason Howard. Jason is editor of Analytic Teaching and Philosophical Practice. He also teaches at Viterbo University in the Ethics, Culture, and Society program, where he is full professor. Professor Howard received his Ph.D. at Catholique University Leuven in Belgium in 2004. He received his MA at Brook University and his VA at Wilfrid Laurim University, both Canadian universities. He has also taught English in the Republic of Korea, otherwise known as South Korea. His recent research includes the philosophy of technology and media ethics, astrobiology, and moral engagement. He's published articles on Kant, Hegel, Schelling, in the field of philosophy of emotions, philosophy of education, philosophy of film, and ethics. He regularly leads seminars on serving the common good and ethical life. With that, welcome, Jason. It's good to see you. And like I said, I've been fascinated from the few conversations that we've had with about your book. And now that it's near publication, maybe you can give a little bit of an overview, and then I'll ask some questions after that.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks. Thank you for having me, Mort. I really appreciate the invitation here. I'm kind of humbled by it, right? In some ways, I think I'm kind of always yeah, somewhat of someone kind of working a little bit kind of on my own, trying to kind of get the word out. But yeah, someone who compared to some of the other people that have been on the program haven't kind of made let's say any kind of earth-shattering or kind of important contributions to anything. But I'm still trying, right? Still trying to get the word out on things that I find interesting. So yeah, the book. I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse again. So the idea is, basically, the scientific case for the likelihood of life elsewhere, kind of astrobiology, and just the kind of the larger significance, right, of the fact that it's no longer really a hypothetical problem, right? We know enough about cosmology, we know enough about evolution, the formation of other planets, and things like this to say that the scientific case is fairly strong for at least microbial life elsewhere. But I think this is really a paradigm shift, a really profound shift in how we kind of think about ourselves and our relationship to the larger cosmos. So, yeah, for the last 8 years, I've been working on issues kind of related to astrobiology, the origin of life, cosmology, and how these things kind of relate together. So, one of the things that's always interested me about philosophy is kind of really interested in the big picture, right? Trying to, locate kind of where we situate in relationship to other things. This has, been of interest, ever since the very beginning with Aristotle and Plato, trying to kind of situate human beings in terms of the larger kind of metaphysics. And in some ways, I see this kind of very similar, right? I mean, although I would say it's not a metaphysical account. I mean, it's a kind of looking at what the sciences can tell us about the likelihood of life elsewhere, and kind of just taking that information and exploring the implications, the consequences, the assumptions that are part of this kind of search for the origin of life. And from where I sit, it's a really profound paradigm shift, really. I mean, it's kind of in itself, it's another kind of Copernican revolution, we could say. Because even if it turns out that it's just microbial life, and that's probably the only life we'll discover, and probably my sense is there's probably microbial life even on some of the Europa and Enceladus, even on some of the moons in our own solar system. But the fact that life may be abundant is, I think, a very, very profound issue. And I'm kind of just interested in looking at how that reorients a lot of our own questions, because if it turns even the idea that we're positioned now to investigate other planets, analyze, the light from their stars to try to see if there's any biosignatures and so on and so forth. That we feel that we're positioned to make, reliable estimates, reliable inferences about the data says a lot about our own confidence in our cognitive powers, in a kind of, we might say, our epistemological priorities. So for me, what the search for life elsewhere does is really reinvigorates a lot of old kind of epistemological problems that people have either dropped or they thought could be kind of resolved. And I'm not claiming that I resolved them, but I am trying to kind of, show that there's a lot of these problems that need to be re-examined in light of this search for life elsewhere. So for me, what's really interesting is when we, just consider, consider Homo sapiens, we're one particular species on this particular planet, contending for existence among, millions of other species. The particular history of our planet itself, right, for life has been on the planet for quite a while, for, debatably almost 4 billion years. So life arose pretty early on. But this raises questions about a lot of our own abilities. So, I mean, here what's interesting is how contingent, how arbitrary, the core abilities might be. So if you think about, from an evolutionary perspective, our ability to engage, let's say, in things like logic, mathematics, higher order scientific reasoning. When it comes to giving objective accounts, right, of the larger cosmos, if it turns out a lot of the abilities, our epistemological abilities, are simply thanks to random, arbitrary evolutionary mutations that could have gone the other way. Right? So it turns out a lot of our gifts are themselves just kind of contingent adaptations that could have turned out very differently. This does ask profound questions about the reliability, right? How objective our actual descriptions are of the larger cosmos. If it turns out these capabilities arose in conditions very, very different from where we are now, right on the savannah, our cognitive powers kind of expanded to hunt down other prey, to be social. Obviously, this is very, very different from trying to analyze the light from other stars, trying to understand what's happening at, the beginning of the universe. So here our cognitive powers are stretched in profound ways. And I really kind of want to explore some of this stretch and confidence in the reliability of the scientific picture. I think it is reliable in the end, but it actually takes a lot of heavy lifting to try to show that even our ability to do logic and mathematics isn't just a random fluke of the species. Because if it is, there's no reason to believe that any of our descriptions of the cosmos are reliable. So I'll stop in a minute. I could go on and on and on, but I won't.
Yeah, well,
so here the idea is just, and these these are old, and this goes all the way back to Plato, right? I mean, the origin of mathematics. I mean, the logic. I mean, these are old philosophical problems about the objectivity of thinking and thought. But again, the whole idea that we're out there, first of all, can we identify life? Can we identify it properly? Because if we can't, how do we generate moral obligations to the things that we find? I mean, all of these things are kind of refreshed, we could say. Because in the end of the day, I think it's important we obviously can distinguish what's alive from what's not alive, because that will be what generates our moral obligations to these other beings. So the need to be epistemologically rigorous and really follow things back to the very beginning to try to give some plausibility to our ability to give objective, reliable, so-called objective, reliable information about the cosmos is a key consideration, because there are implications here in ways that might not hold for just us on the planet. So, for example, if we miscategorize something that happens to be alive, we call it dead. You can imagine the harm we might do. we have lots of examples of this kind of mischaracterization, even on our own planet. And again, just, how do we think about ethics? Most of us think about ethics in terms of, here on this particular planet, obligations to other kind of species, obligations mostly from people to people, perhaps from generation to generation. But if we ask whether our obligations would hold to beings that aren't from Earth, this is a new way into the problem. Because if it turns out the only reason we have obligations are the beings that either look like us or live on the same planet, I mean, if considering there are millions of other galaxies and billions of other planets, this starts to kind of, again, look rather arbitrary, our distinction to just care for things that happen to be, on our own particular planet. And this leads into other kinds of problems. So again, I'll just end here more. So for the longest time, all of our theories in physics and cosmology assumed that the universe was just matter in motion, right? I mean, so the idea that life could be fairly abundant was not even really on anybody's radar for a very, very long time. So the physical theories we have about time, about space, are certainly conducive to understanding the concentration of matter and other things like that, but they're not particularly conducive to understanding complex biotic formations, like origin of life, which seem to operate from different principles than just entropy, let's say. So I'm kind of trying to bring all these things together, and the hope is to try to kind of show people that philosophy still has a lot to add to this problem, insofar as it's still open-ended, right? We really don't know whether there's life out there. There's a strong scientific case, but because it's so open-ended, this brings up the issue of assumptions in a way that just might not be the case for other more traditional kinds of scientific undertaking.
Well, when I think about this, I think about a couple of things. One is that the disk that was sent out and is still going out into space beyond our galaxy that has all of these things that might identify us as a species. But when I think about that, I think about the whole idea of metaphor and how most of our metaphors are based on an upright, looking forward, two-eared auditory capacity. And maybe this is a silly example, but I always think, well, what if we human beings were wall-eyed and we only saw the world this way? Well, that has all kinds of implications for how we would think about another creature. And what if they have a whole different orientation to the world, would we recognize that as like us?
Yeah. And that's exactly, I mean, and again, if you think about it, I mean, and this has always been a potential problem, right? A hypothetical thought experiment, right? But now there's a sense in which these are like legitimate questions now, because again, it's very unlikely that other organisms would have the same evolutionary career as we do here. And this, of course, itself is debatable, right? Whether they would or they wouldn't. So yeah, it just raises interesting issues. I mean, could we even communicate, right? What would it mean? I mean, is there any way in which another entity could understand any idea of anything we say? Now, it seems like this, I mean, one could say, well, who cares, right? I mean, big deal, right? But it turns out it does matter because, for example, if our scientific theories are really giving us a decent approximation of the way things are, then any species that investigates, the universe ought to come to somewhat similar conclusions, right? There'll be causality, there'll be gravity. I mean, there'll be similar kinds of constraints that any being will have to negotiate in order to survive. So for me, what's really profound is just trying to figure out, and here, of course, we're just speculating, right? I mean, how much of an overlap we're likely to get here. both in conceptual abilities, right, in the way we might conceive the universe, and whether there's another entity out there that can build starships and travel. My sense is probably they're going to have to know a lot about math and physics, probably, in order to get anything off the ground. And so the issue is, if we live in one universe, and I think we do, there must be some similar laws that we'll be discovering, right? I mean, regardless of how separated we are. And I would even say, in terms of, I mean, and we're going back to Kant now. I mean, Kant was one of the first philosophers to really argue for the idea that the moral law is true everywhere, right? I have problems with Kant's kind of, his argument, but he's pretty, optimistic that if we were to find other reasonable beings on Alpha Centauri, they'd be under the same moral law as us. So to me, that's always struck me as a really, really very profound way to think about morality and even moral obligation. I mean, how far does it extend? I mean, and I think there's good reason to believe, certainly we can care about other species on our own planet that, don't even need to be intelligent, right? I mean, so that we can care for species on our own planet, I think does bode relatively well for our ability to have some kind of moral relationship with entities elsewhere. And unlike Kant, this does not have to be reciprocated. They don't have to be rational, they don't have to be reasonable. But we do have to be, so in other words, we have to be able to see these entities at work in the world, doing certain things that we could have some kind of recognition or commonality about. That's all it will take, though, right? So the bar is pretty low, actually, whether or not we could care for entities other than ourselves. But of course, we have to be able to see them, let's say, at work in the world. Doesn't matter whether they're rational. I mean, none of them. Doesn't matter if they're not. They look different from us, so on and so forth. All of these things could play some role, but in the end, I think we could generate obligations, based on simply the shared mortal condition of animals trying to survive and piece together a world. So that's following from your example, Mort, to again just see what unity might we expect. And go ahead, Mort.
No, I was just going to say, I remember from earlier discussions that one of the people that was maybe helpful in your thinking about some of these things was a 15th century Italian philosopher.
You mean like maybe Giordano Bruno?
Yes.
So or suggesting such things, but yeah, I mean it's a very, very long debate, and it's kind of I mean it's risen and it's gone up and down in terms of being part of the, let's say, the public imagination. But for me, what's so profound now is because the scientific case has shifted for life elsewhere. For the longest time, like during the 50s and 60s, you said you're kind of really interested in life elsewhere. Probably it wouldn't be very well received, right? I mean, you'd be kind of beside the parapsychologists, right? I mean, trying to kind of seek out all different kinds of, wonky phenomenon. Now the case is really, really shifted. I mean, most people assume life can only be explained if it's a recurring event. Because if it's not a recurring event, there's nothing to explain. Right? From a scientific perspective, if these aren't causal patterns that could recur, then essentially it's a miracle, and there's nothing to do but just go, what are we going to do, and move on, right? So the more you think about the problem, you really have to admit that it's a kind of cosmic phenomenon, and we're one instance of it. Otherwise, as far as the scientific picture goes, and that's kind of really what I'm interested in, it's really philosophy of science. We can't even get the show off the ground. So, and I'm thinking back again to Kant, who, the whole idea that Kant was convinced that, the moral law would be applicable to all rational beings, right? Beings of practical reasoning, regardless of their evolutionary, contingencies or embodiment or what have you. And he has that wonderful saying, right? I mean, what is it? Nothing fills the mind with ever increasing wonder and admiration more steadily and readily one reflects on them than the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Right?
Mhm.
And how, what exactly is, the connection between these two things? And that's always been, a deep motivation for me. But the truth is, for the longest time, I didn't think I was up to it because I just didn't have, I didn't know enough about, evolution. I didn't know enough about cosmology. I mean, I didn't know enough about astrophysics and I'm not an expert in any of these things, mind you, right? But I have spent the last 8 years reading an awful lot about them. So I can at least give a plausible account of what these people think that they're doing. Because it's just really a series of if-then arguments. And if this is true, then what, right? If this is false, then what? I mean, that's my job as a philosopher, is to really just explore the kind of implications of particular conclusions and also some of the assumptions, right, that are built in to some of these theories about life elsewhere, about evolutionary kind of, whether there's going to be a lot of evolutionary contingencies, or there's going to be a lot of convergences or what have you. And yeah, my hope is that this is the kind of thing that so this is, I have a hard time understanding why everyone isn't super excited about this prospect. I know a lot of people aren't, but this is part of it. I just get stuck in my own head, kind of convincing myself that, I mean, in many ways, these are some of the most compelling questions we can contend to. And they all are practical because it has to do with our own planet, the fate of our planet. Certainly there's many things we can do as Homo sapiens, right, as human beings, that just there doesn't seem to be any other entities anywhere around that can do what we can do. We are able to participate in our own lives in ways that are simply fundamentally different from any other organism we've ever encountered and may ever encounter. And so, part of the book is by kind of looking at the larger cosmos, it kind of reminds us of how special and important we are. And even kind of trying to, cultivate even a sense of reverence, for our place kind of in the nature of things.
Yes. This is very interesting because I'm maybe not exactly, but to some degree looking at some of the things in a tangential, at least, way. And what I've been fascinated with lately is Vico, and his whole idea about the new science and his anti-Cartesian critique, and the whole way that knowledge is constructed. And he's kind of changed my perspective on how knowledge is constructed and the role of, and then I'm making a big leap. I'm also looking at people like Marshall McLuhan and the whole role of language and the role of reading and writing and what that does to those kinds of questions and what it does to the human memory and all of those issues and how technology in the larger sense affects human development. And I think maybe in that way, at least, it's somewhat connected to the kinds of things that you're looking at, because it's a question of epistemology and
Sure.
development of various kinds of mindsets that we might have to explore who we are and where we are and what we are.
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, so part of the interest in this project, right, of origin of life, trying to figure out, where it is that it's completely interdisciplinary, right? I mean, there's no, so many, just from the terms of the sciences, right? It's the life sciences, it's the physical sciences, it's, it's cosmology, but also there's a normative aspect, right? The normative for me, just the whole idea of going out, and, planting a flag and claiming a planet as our own. It's just full of all kinds of normative questions that can only be solved really properly, right, from disciplines that are interested in the normative.
Right.
So, whether this be philosophy or whether this be, art or, disciplines that are interested in evaluative questions that in many ways are not going to have a clear-cut, definitive, empirical, factual, yep, on to the next issue.
Yeah.
So, all of these normative issues are really, I think, in the end, impossible to separate from larger questions of even how life is defined. What would we do with it if we found it? What obligations do we have? It kind of takes all of the questions that are already active, here, and really just kind of throws it out there as a reminder, that in the end, the normative is part of our identity. And I think, the project of searching for life elsewhere really kind of reinforces, as we take to the stars, if we ever do, these kinds of questions about what we ought to do, what we owe one another, what we owe the planets we discover, what we owe our own planet. There'll always be oughts, right? These are always questions that are formulated as shoulds. And there's of perspectives. And so again, one of the things that interested, kind of really interested me in it, attending some of these conferences back in like 2016, 2017 on astrobiology, it was just so refreshing to see the wide variety, of people at these conferences, from the humanities, from the sciences, and this is one of the things that has also kind of always, interested me also in, philosophy for children and in that kind of education as well, is you do end up with people from a wide variety of intellectual commitments, let's say philosophical commitments, kind of all kind of recognizing, the priority of education and the role philosophy can play in trying to kind of elevate, let's say, the fullest promise of an evolutionary perspective,
Well,
educational perspective.
let's take this conversation and maybe see if we can blend two pieces. One is your relatively new major at Viterbo, which again I always forget the name of, but it is ethics, culture, and society.
Yeah.
And that seems to be an effort to integrate all of those multidisciplinary issues that you're talking about in your astro project.
Astrobiology. Yeah, sure. The major that I helped design, and wasn't, we all got together and designed it. It's certainly an effort to kind of, try to help the students understand at the end of the day, all of the problems we're facing require, really a variety of different disciplinary lenses to kind of bring it into perspective. And if you think about how disciplines kind of just lock people in, right, to one particular view of the world, it's extremely important to kind of realize, there's a variety of ways to read and interpret the world.
Yeah.
Of course, it's a big ask in some ways because, for one thing, it's in some ways it's hard to just get students aware or at least competent in certain, methodological concerns within one particular discipline. So part of the idea is just a kind of reminder that one's a methodology to perspective can create blinders, right? A kind of, silo to say too much, but I think we're suffering from this problem. globally and politically, actually, an inability to kind of realize the necessity of different frames of reference to get a kind of, again, I mean, a wholehearted, the best picture we're able to get, right, from the most well-informed disciplines that can say something interesting about this particular problem. I mean, you name it, whether it's poverty or climate change or mental health. I mean, all of these disciplines require either expertise from other disciplines to get the case right, or they certainly require expertise to solve problems, right? I mean, all different kinds of folks need to get on board to institute policies or, laws or what have you. And in some ways, it's kind of discouraging because in some ways, it seems like the problems we're confronted with are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The perspectives, I mean, on a good way, I mean, think about astrobiology, right? We're well aware now that, we're just one species, one particular planet among billions of other planets. So visions are getting shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, rather than really responding to the complexity of the world around us and owning up to the precarious, fragile position we're in, even as a species, on this particular planet at this particular point in time.
Well, that sort of brings us back in a way to analytic teaching and philosophical practice, and the evolution of that journal and the whole idea of philosophy for children. In that, I have been continually struck by the fact that while there is a Deweyan thread to everything within philosophy for children, we find people who are analytic philosophers who are, just recently people who are using Bentham as their kind of benchmark, and phenomenologists, everybody kind of talking about some of the same issues from different perspectives, and sometimes to the advantage of the reader, and sometimes I think to the disadvantage of the reader, to not specifically identify the philosophical perspective that they're coming from. And I don't know, maybe that's just my bias on this, but it seems to me that, like I said, sometimes it's advantageous to not know the perspective, philosophical perspective of the author, and sometimes I think it would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. I mean, I started out, I mean, my own education, for a little while, I mean, I suppose, I mean, looking back, for a little while, I was, fairly, committed Husserlian, really kind of love Husserl, then it moved on to kind of Hegel. And now, now I think as I get older, I'm really, I guess in the end, a pragmatist, I suppose you could say. I mean, broadly construed, right? I mean, what we want is things to work, be able to measure things effectively. And I guess, part of this is how much one kind of needs to know, right, about the sources of here, either philosophy for children or, the sources of the problem one brings up in the classroom. I think that's a hard kind of question to answer in the end. I mean, I think in some ways, Dewey, I've always, Dewey is someone I always go back to. I mean, there's certain people that are just touchstones, right? And you're kind of, even though I haven't written that much about Dewey, he's someone I'm always kind of returning to, just because I think in so many ways, he kind of gets so many things right. I think in the end, and I mean, one of the things that has always kind of interested me about this particular kind of undertaking that Dewey tries to kind of look at is that the most important contribution that philosophers and philosophy can ever really make is the ability of philosophy to kind of introduce a really robust skill set in communal inquiry, right? In reasoning.
Mm.
So it's critical, right? But it's also creative. I mean, it's also social. I mean, all of these things are kind of, part of what I think philosophy can do really, really well. Just with the theory, just the different kinds of problems that are introduced. Ordinarily, I mean, philosophical problems. I mean, again, most of us realize, philosophy doesn't necessarily give definitive answers to things. But what it does do is it reminds us of the plausible, right? So for any given problem, we have a variety of plausible accounts, and then we just can kind of, explore this issue. So my own sense is that, this is really what, following from the whole P4C movement and Dewey and, all the different theoreticians who have written on this, what we want is a kind of critical, caring, creative, collaborative reasoning. If we're going to, and this is what reasoning would look like at its best. And I can see teachers being able to do that without having a lot of background, right, in philosophy, but just kind of having a love of this commitment to collaborative inquiry, right? A kind of a love of commitment to making sure that we get a diversity of voices going here, and that we kind of slowly try to step back and move through these different perspectives in a way that does justice to their complexity and that does justice to the insights that the students themselves kind of have to bear. So, looking back, I think it was you that originally introduced me to P4C so many years back, when almost 20 years ago, and I've always, been committed, to its vision, and yeah, I mean, even though I'm not out in the field doing P4C, I mean, as much as I was in the past, because just a lot of the classes I teach now don't have. It's harder for me to bring that in, as another element. But I spent 15, 16 years almost every year, every other year doing P4C in the schools, and I'm certainly more convinced than ever before that it is the way to it's the way to proceed. And I know they're having students talk about things that matter, and listening to one another in a somewhat critical spirit is already a gigantic gain. So, whatever we want to call that, I mean, you want to call it philosophy, I mean, you call it whatever you want, but in the end, and this goes back to the problems of technology and everything else, when we are losing our ability, I think, in some ways, to simply give people the benefit of the doubt and really want to listen to perspectives that aren't our own in a way that just isn't filled with a lot of kind of resentment or bias or skepticism, because your view isn't my view. I mean, just again, I don't want to talk a lot about politics, but clearly we're living in a very kind of bifurcated, polarized environment, and part of this is the idea that somehow things are true simply because we want them to be.
Right.
As if that's enough, right? I mean, and my own sense is that's a cousin to nihilism, right? Once we assume things are simply true because we want them to be, you're already kind of on your way towards a kind of radical nihilism that unfortunately we'll discover when it's far too late, because the world is not whatever we simply want it to be because we imagine it should be this way.
Well, let me just kind of wrap this up a little bit by and maybe won't be a total wrap, but if there is such a thing, but just in terms of the history of the journal, one thing that might be interesting is, I think I sort of renamed the journal Analytic Teaching, the Journal of Community of Inquiry, to focus on the community of inquiry. And then you made a move, which is to call it Analytic Teaching and Philosophical Practice. And I think in some ways we kind of had the same goal with a different language. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean,
a little bit.
But yeah, part of my, and again, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I am proud of the journal, but it's always one of those things where, I mean, I wish I could do more for the journal. I'm always, somewhat a little kind of disappointed that, I mean, I haven't, done more but you know how it is, it was just limited amounts of time to do things. But, I mean, part of it was just to try to kind of, when I took over, being the kind of the editor, of the journal, in the hope that, by bringing in both kind of traditions, uh, people who, let's say, might not know a lot about philosophy for children would then maybe read the journal, become interested in philosophy for children, and start doing philosophy for children.
Yeah.
This is perhaps a naive idea, but and likewise, right, people who were kind of doing philosophy for children, in communal inquiry would also just be kind of exposed to larger problems, policy issues afoot, that aren't kind of coming at the issue from just the sole perspective of Lippmann or Dewey or these other kind of core figures in the tradition of philosophy. But as you're probably aware, I mean, and I think this is true, I've tried to double check numerous times, but as far as I know, it is the oldest continually running journal dedicated to philosophy for children in the world. And that's not nothing. I mean,
That's
I
right.
mean, it may not have a gigantic readership, but I feel like it's kind of, it's a lighthouse, right, in a way. I mean, it's kind of, it's a light, trying to kind of provide a fairly diverse, kind of robust reminder of, again, the variety of ways one can take to issues of education while still remaining, I would like to hope, pretty firmly anchored in the kind of the philosophy of children tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how that relates again to the community of inquiry, because in the end, as far as I'm concerned, the community of inquiry ought to be the default model for all investigations of all kinds, actually. I mean, not necessarily teaching kids how to become better reasoners, but I mean, all problems in some way, we should be able to sit down and first open them up, right? By exploring what's going on, and then kind of stepping back and seeing what we can learn from that. Uh, and I think again, I mean, even the willingness to do that. I mean, the idea that one could be open to a variety of different perspectives, recognizing that not that one's mistaken, but that perhaps one's position could be elaborated, could be extended out a bit. Maybe you could show me something I didn't realize, right, about the position that I'm, kind of endorsing. And again, that's always been an appeal to me, and I think it remains again a hope moving forward. But this is something again that we ought to do, we should do. There's all different kinds of ways of educating people, and in terms of how we ought to or how we should proceed. I think there's much to be said about the community of inquiry approach.
I would just like to say thank you, Jason. We'll see how this turns out. I will stop recording and we'll see where we are.